Okay, welcome back everyone. We start the afternoon sessions of the new Fellows Symposium with William Laurance, who's a world-leading conservation ecologist of tropical forests and their biodiversity, who's made a remarkable array of important scientific findings on the effects of habitat fragmentation, logging, fires, climate change, exotic pathogens on tropical ecosystems. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Marilyn. Well, like everyone else, I just want to say how much I hugely appreciate having this opportunity to be nominated and be elected to the Academy. That is obviously, really a pinnacle, I think, of many people's scientific careers, is to have an honor like that. And by the way, I hope you'll be able to understand me okay, despite my very strong North Queensland accent. I also had just one little message for the New South Welshmen in the audience. Go the Maroons. Just kidding. I want to talk about tropical wilderness areas and why they're important and what's happening to them, and a little bit about some of our work that's focusing on this. A lot of species we know in the tropics are ecologically specialized. Of course, they're very ancient ecosystems and they're extremely diverse ecosystems. They are the most biologically rich real estate on the planet, and many of the species in tropics do require wilderness areas, oftentimes quite extensive wilderness areas. Some examples of things that tend to need large areas of relatively intact habitat include things like top predators, tigers, jaguars, harpy eagles, for example. Many different large-bodied species require very extensive areas. Some of these things undergo extensive seasonal migrations. There are also many migratory species in the tropics, particularly species that tend to move up and down elevational gradients that are tracking differing patterns of flowering and fruiting and leaf production at different times of the year. So this is a very common pattern that we see in a lot of tropical species. And also there are just many specialists, many species that tend to be rare, but they just tend to be very strongly restricted to deep forest interior habitats. For instance, my wife, as part of her PhD, actually translocated birds within the Amazon rainforest. That you could take a bird and you could move it 2 kilometers inside the rainforest off of its territory, and within that same day it would be back on its territory. You could take that same bird and move it across a 60-meter wide road and it would not go back. Okay, so it's remarkable how strong the fidelity of some of these things have to intact forests. And you can see this kind of the importance, the biological importance of primary forest here. This is an analysis we did a few years ago. This dotted line represents the biodiversity of an intact tropical rainforest. This is a meta-analysis. And then here are different kinds of land uses, and the further you are away from that line, the more different your biodiversity or your biota is from the intact forest. And you can see that most of the different kinds of land uses that we're seeing in the tropics right now really transform the landscape biologically. Now, the one bit of good news is that there is one land use type, which is selective logging, which does in fact appear to retain a lot of its biodiversity values, also a lot of its considerable amount of its carbon storage and other values too. So that's an important result. And it's particularly important in the context of the modern world, because what's happened is that vast areas of the world's tropical forests have been logged or are slated to be logged. It's about 400 million hectares in total. And so most of these lands here that are modified are in fact selectively logged forests. And one of the real unfortunate things is that these logged forests, because they're eroded, they have, there's many roads been bulldozed through them, they're extremely vulnerable to subsequent conversion for things like oil palm, for wood pulp plantations, for slash and burn farming, for all kinds of things. And so what we're really trying to do now is to convince and try to come up with mechanisms to convince tropical governments to hold on to these log forests, because in fact in many cases that's the last sort of conservation opportunities we have. That there isn't much outside of protected areas that in fact hasn't been logged. Wilderness is also, of course, very important for various kinds of ecosystem processes. One of the really important things that they do is that they produce vast amounts of water vapor. Of course, that happens via the process of evapotranspiration. When plants open up the stomates in their leaves, for every 1 molecule of CO2 that diffuses in, on average about 180 molecules of water diffuse out. And so these rainforests, which of course have gazillions of leaves, are massive sources of water vapor. And that water vapor does a couple of really important things. One is it forms a lot of clouds at tropical latitudes, which of course is where the solar radiation is very intense. And those clouds reflect a great deal of heat back into space, and that helps to mitigate global warming. The other thing that those forests do is they're actually producing a lot of clouds, especially during the dry season. And the dry season is when the forests are most stressed and are most prone to fires. And so they play a very important role in that sense. Another kind of thing they do, of course, Tropical forests basically act like a giant biological sponge. If you denude a landscape and you get heavy rains, the water just rushes off the land surface. It floods streams, it floods down rivers. You can have catastrophic flooding in many parts of the world, causing billions of dollars and costing thousands of lives in many cases. But the forests are very good at sort of releasing the water slowly. Also, they manage to maintain those streams, and so the streams are not being depleted and having impacts on aquatic biodiversity during the dry season when there's stream failure. And finally, of course, we know tropical forests are very important in terms of storing lots of carbon. Hundreds of billions of tons of carbon are stored in tropical forests. The destruction and degradation of tropical forests today probably causes about 15% of all the greenhouse gas emissions that we're experiencing right now. So that's a pretty important figure on its own. Unfortunately, tropical areas are just under assault. They really are suffering in many different ways. One of the things that we're seeing happening so dramatically right now is a massive tsunami of infrastructure expansion. It's expected by the year 2050 that we're going to have about 25 million kilometers of new paved highways. About 90% of those are going to be in developing countries. There's also right now about 3,700 dams that are either under construction or being planned for the near future, large hydroelectric dams. Most of those are in developing nations. When the G20 nations met here in Australia, they pledged to put between $60 and $70 trillion in new infrastructure, which would be roads, highways, power lines, gas lines, energy infrastructure, other kinds of things. Over the next 15 years, that would more than double the total investment in infrastructure across the planet. Everywhere we look, we see a feeding frenzy of mining activity in Africa right now, for instance, with China alone investing more than $120 billion a year in mining activity. All of this stuff is creating very powerful economic impetus for road building and for infrastructure expansion across the planet. Here's just an example of this. This is the Congo Basin. You know, we tend to think of this as one of the world's great wilderness areas. Here you can see major roads in the Congo. In fact, even if you zoom in using higher resolution techniques, you see, in fact, that there's lots of smaller scale roads that have been created by logging operations. As a consequence, there's been about 50,000 kilometers of roads built in the Congo Basin since the year 2000. There's been an epic slaughter of forest elephants because hunters armed with modern technologies like rifles and cable snares are now penetrating into the Congo, and there's basically very few places for elephants to hide anymore. So roads do have really serious impacts, and it's very alarming that they're penetrating so rapidly and so dramatically into the world's last remaining wilderness areas. Here you can see in northern Bolivia, the areas in dark are major logging roads, the areas in red are major forest fires, and you don't have to stare at that very long to see there's a very strong relationship between where the roads are and where the fires are occurring. This is increases in forest fires as a function of distances away from roads in the Brazilian Amazon. This is outside protected areas, and you can even see inside protected areas, we're still seeing a non-trivial rise in forest fires as a consequence of distances to roads. Roads do a lot of other things. Of course, they're physically opening up forests. They're allowing hunters to invade, illegal miners to invade. If you want to get really depressed, go onto YouTube and look up the Carnegie Airborne Observatory's overflights of the Peruvian Amazon right now, where you see moonscapes of land being converted by illegal gold mining. It's just truly appalling. We've been doing a lot of work on trying to ask where on the earth should roads go and where should they not go? And this was the end result of a fairly complicated analysis we did, but we tried to look at biodiversity values and endemism and endangered species and critical ecosystem services on the one hand, and also where would roads produce the maximum social and economic benefits for people, particularly for food production, of course, because we know that global food security is going to be a major issue in the future. So the areas in green, according to this scheme, are areas where roads ideally should not go because they've got such high biodiversity values and relatively low road benefits values. The areas in red are where roads nominally should be concentrated because that's where you're going to get the biggest benefits with relatively small environmental costs. And the areas in black are conflict areas, which is where you've got high environmental values and high potential road benefit values. And you can see there's large areas of the world, particularly in places like sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America, that are going to have there are going to be many conservation battles being fought in the future over a lot of these projects. Another thing that's a major concern is that, of course, protected areas are really the cornerstone of our efforts to try to conserve the tropical world, but these protected areas are coming under increasing pressure. For example, this is where one of my PhD students is working in peninsular Malaysia. Here you can see they've cleared right up to the very margins of the protected area in order to plant oil palm. These are some animals that were killed inside a protected area in Gabon in Africa, just basically by poachers. Reserves in many parts of the world are really coming under a lot of pressure. They're being isolated, They're being degraded in various ways. This is an analysis we did of 60 protected areas stratified across the tropical world, and we assessed the relative impacts of different kinds of environmental threats on biodiversity indicators. And this shows you the correlation between the threats happening immediately outside the protected area and inside the protected area. And what you can see here is that there's almost all the correlations are positive. So for instance, if you're getting a lot of logging and a lot of hunting and a lot of mining outside a protected area, those threats tend to leak inside to some degree inside the protected area, or that protected area tends to mirror the threats happening outside that. And that's really a major concern because we're seeing such dramatic changes around many protected areas in the world. You can see this sort of thing playing out in different ways. This is an analysis we did. By the way, I should just mention this analysis actually had 215 co-authors, and I want to mention that I contemplated both suicide and homicide at various times before this thing saw the light of day. But anyway, when we looked at these 60 protected areas stratified across the tropical world, we actually found that exactly half of them appeared to be succeeding relatively well. In other words, if we looked at the indicators, these are various biodiversity indicators here, they, in some cases they're improving, some cases they're declining, but overall they're kind of holding their own and doing okay. But the other half, unfortunately, were declining. And not only were they declining, the declines were really sweeping in nature, both in a taxonomic sense and in a functional sense. We're not just seeing a few species declining in these reserves, we're seeing sweeping changes across large components of the ecosystems, and that really is alarming. It says that there's something fundamentally wrong. And really the two key factors are how much investment is going into protecting the protected area in terms of having park guards and on the ground enforcement. And the second thing is we're seeing the dramatic destruction of lands and degradation of lands around the protected areas. And increasingly they're becoming habitat fragments or becoming islands. So that is a major concern. So the bottom line is tropical nature, if we're going to hope to conserve the biodiversity of really the richest and biologically most important and most complex ecosystems on the planet, we need extensive wilderness areas, and unfortunately, right now, those wilderness areas are under tremendous pressure. Really, they're under assault. Thank you.
Questions? Can you go to the microphone, please?
Thank you for your talk, it's great. A wonderful member of this academy sadly recently passed away, Michael Ralpak, used to say that tragedies of the common problems have solutions, but they require high social capital. So, do you agree? And if you agree, how do you get high social capital in an international arena?
Yeah, that's one of the great challenges I think we're facing. Also, of course, human populations are growing, and the latest United Nations projections suggest that we're going to have somewhere on the order of between 10 and 12 billion people by the latter part of this century, according to the best models that they have, and even then the population won't have stabilized. So most of that growth is occurring in developing nations, and I think we're facing tremendous challenges. When we talk about raising capital, I assume you're talking about human development indices, education, these kinds of factors which are going to be very important in terms of livelihoods and in terms of making wise and informed decisions. I would say if there's one single issue I would focus on, it would be this, education for young women. That's absolutely the most important thing that I think we need to talk about demographically, because if you educate young women and give them opportunities, you tend to delay the age of first reproduction, and that correlates with an amazing number of positive things. Having a child, your first child at say 23 versus 17, means you tend to have smaller families, you tend to have more stable families, the children tend to be better educated, there tend to be lower rates of divorce, those children tend to have better employment opportunities, they tend to be much less likely to be socially disenfranchised and say, for instance, attracted by extremist groups. There are so many positives that come out of educating young women and giving them opportunities that I think this should be really a rallying cry, and especially in the developing world where populations right now are still growing very, very, very rapidly.
Thank you.
Here, here. Any other questions? Nick?
What about the role of actually having concessions for ecotourism around national parks to get local populations vested in the maintenance of the parks, particularly to reduce poaching?
I think that's an excellent idea, and there are models, there's various kinds of models that are being developed. I mean, there's biosphere reserve models, and there's, in various cases, there are efforts being made to try to do that. For instance, I was just in Cambodia. There's a place there called Elephant Valley, which is actually providing a very important buffer for the northern part of what's called SEMA protected area, and it's precisely that. It's a ecotourism operation which is being very avidly supported by the park managers and also by the Wildlife Conservation Society. So I think those are the kinds of solutions we need to think about. The problem is really the scale and the pace of what's happening right now. And ecotourism is part of the problem, but I mean, part of a solution, but it's, boy, we need a lot of it, we need it fast. I just saw a figure recently, I just trying to remember what it was, but I think protected areas currently attract something like 800 million visitors per year. So there is a significant amount of ecotourism going on.
A quick one, Jean.
Is there anything that you can pinpoint that makes a difference between a reserve that's struggling and one that's successful?
Two things, yes. The reserves that are successful tend to have better on-the-ground protection, and they tend to have much less dramatic changes happening immediately outside them. So it's both threats from within and the threats without, but there's this very strong leakage effect. What it really says is we can't just draw lines on and have these little postage stamp protected areas and say, now we've done our job. We have to think about them embedded in the broader landscape. We have to think about managing and making that broader landscape more benign, because if we don't do it, the biodiversity is really going to suffer.
Thank you very much.